Hi everybody and welcome back to the Kylemore Book Club. This week we're going to be talking about a film rather than a book, Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window. Why would we talk about this film in the context of this course? It's obviously not a story that is set in a pandemic, there isn't a plague, but it is about lockdown. It is about what happens to the mind when we are in isolation, when we are isolated from our usual social contexts. This film was made in 1954, which, if you think about it, is a short time after the end of the Second World War. During the Second World War, as you know, the roles of both men and women changed dramatically. And in the 1950s, we see a situation whereby people who were out either physically fighting the war or working on the home front had to recalibrate themselves to ordinary domestic routine again. This process of redomestication, if you like, after the war, I think provides some of the background to this film. It's barely present at all. It's not mentioned really in the film. But the situation of our protagonist, Jeff, in quarantine, suddenly confined to the domestic space and not able to travel and do his exciting work, I think reflects this historical post-war background. So our situation is one that in some ways is familiar to us who have lived through the lockdowns of COVID-19. We have a man who is on lockdown. He's immobilized, confined to his home. His life has suddenly stopped. He's cut off from travel, and in his job as a photographer and foreign photographer, he did a lot of travel. He talks about it a lot. It's something he misses. He's cut off from that. He's also cut off from routine, from his ordinary professional round, from meeting people, meeting his friends, going to bars and restaurants. The public realm, the world outside his domestic space, is glimpsed tantalizingly in this film, always in the same shot. We can see this one little alleyway, and at the end of it, a kind of bar and restaurant and a street. This visual setup emphasizes not just that the public realm is inaccessible to him, locked away in his private apartment, but also incites a kind of longing to get there, to see what's happening there. We see just little flashes of it, but as soon as somebody turns left or right at the end of that little alleyway, they vanish from his view and from ours. So the public realm is not just inaccessible, but kind of tantalizing. So in response to this isolation, as in the Decameron, we see a set of compensations. All of the stimuli that no longer enter his world, the kind of going out, socializing, being out in the public realm, seeing people, going to work, the absence of that is compensated for by psychologically within his domestic space. Obviously, his compensation is looking at his neighbors. He looks out the window and observes what his neighbors do. But also, underneath the surface, he's doing something very like the characters in the Decameron. When we looked at the Decameron, I described what the characters do to ensure their psychic survival, to compensate for the lack of social life, for the lack of life out in the outside world, was that they drew down on what they already had in their minds. They rummaged through their own minds to see what they could come up with. Instead of traveling physically, they traveled mentally. And in fact, that's what Jeff does too. Unable to travel physically, he travels in the mind. In lockdown, because we're not out in the world, because we're not able to project ourselves into the future, because we lose our usual frameworks of identity, our professional ones, our social ones, we are confronted with ourselves. Lockdown produces an encounter with the self, which can often be, as in the case of Rear Window, uncomfortable or troubling. Part of the plot of Rear Window, in fact, is Jeff. He's recreating the excitement of the world that he has lost through his own mind. In a way, what we have in the film is what happens to a mind when it is left unchecked to grow in the wild, as it were. When we just leave a mind without the usual checks and balances of social life and routines to see where it goes, what it becomes. What, in other words, is really in there? That's the question that the film explores. This is a film that works on several different levels. On the first level, we have the story of a man confined to his home who spies on his neighbors, or at least watches his neighbors, and witnesses a murder. And through this this watching of these neighbors in particular, the Thorwalds, we get several other stories about his neighbors: Miss Torso, Miss Lonely Hearts, the musician. So the lives of his surrounding neighbors and also his own life. So that's the top surface literal level. But the film also works on a number of symbolic and psychological levels. The film is an exploration of the mind as well as an exploration of characters or events. There are several hints throughout the film that what Jeff sees across the courtyard can be understood not only as real events, but also as a symbolic version of what is happening in his life. What happens on the other side of the courtyard is almost like a theater of the repressed instincts of his world being played out, a theater in which his repressed instincts are played out.